Greetings and welcome to Raven's Roost Forge. I'm your host Tate, and today we're going to work on making blacksmith tongs without actually having a pair of blacksmith tongs. Let's get started. This project uses about 24 inches of half-inch round steel. You could also use rebar. Here I'm marking out about an inch on that little anvil, and then I'm going to place the end of the bar in line with that mark, tilt it down, and then make a little divot that's going to be the start of these tongs. So there you can see I just made a divot in the end of the bar about an inch in. Now what I'm going to do is actually go ahead and make a flat all the way down to the end of the bar, and that will be the start of the tong jaws. So after cleaning it up, you can see that I just have a flat all the way to the end of the bar. And this is just a little drawing to kind of show exactly what I was doing and the other steps. And we'll come back to this a little later. One problem with this small barbecue grill forge is that with a bigger bar, it wants to keep levering itself out of the fire because there's nothing to hold up the weight of the bar. So what I'm doing here is just making a little holder. This piece of wood is long enough to hold the bar in a fire. I drilled a hole in it that's bigger than the bar, and now it can hold up the end of the bar for me, so I don't have to worry about it coming out of the fire. In this next heat, I'm just dressing the thickness of that jaw a little bit more. I want it to be about half the thickness of the parent bar, so we want it to be about 1/4 inch. At this stage, we want to leave it a little bit thick so that we can bring it to final thickness later. In the next heat, we're going to be working on the boss of the tongs. These tongs will be for holding in the left hand, so you'll want to turn the tong 90 degrees to the left and then begin flattening the area just behind the jaw. If you can't quite visualize what I'm doing here, just hold on for a moment. We're going to go back to that drawing and you'll see what I'm talking about. So what you should end up with is two flats oriented 90 degrees to one another. So what I've done in this heat is I've turned the blank to the left 90 degrees, moved to the other side of the anvil, and I flattened the area behind the jaw. This is eventually where the rivet will go. During this heat, we're going to start the transition between the boss and the reins. So we want to flip the bar another 90 degrees towards the left, move the bar about 3/4 inch further over the edge of the anvil, and then form a step down using half face blows. And then we're going to flatten that transition a little bit. So you'll end up with 3 different shoulders that actually form the jaw and boss of the tong. In the final portion of this drawing, you can see that I flipped it 90 degrees and I made another step down by hammering over the edge of the anvil to form the transition to the reins. Since we're using a fairly small bar and we're going to be making a fairly small pair of tongs, these shoulders are not going to be that big that separate the reins from the boss and the boss from the jaws. Here you can see that what I'm doing is I'm just extending that flat so that the boss and the first part of the reins are the same thickness. This way the reins don't interfere with each other when you're opening and closing the tongs. And then here I'm just dressing that a little more and making everything nice and flat and uniform and nice and crisp. And then we're going to neck down that transition between the boss and the reins a little bit more so that it just looks a little nicer. It's not really necessary for the function of the tongs though. Because we use small half-inch stock for these, they're not going to have a very pronounced boss. This doesn't affect the tongs functionally. They just don't look as nice as if you start with larger stock. The boss will expand a little when we punch the hole in it though. Right now I'm just putting a center punch in the very center of that boss. And then I'm going to use a tapered punch to punch a hole. We're just marking the spot now though. Here you can just see that little punch mark. So now we're going to deepen that punch and we're going to punch most of the way through. When you get almost through, you'll feel a little rebound from the anvil below. You want to make sure that you cool the punch frequently so that it doesn't deform. And here you can see that punch most of the way through. So we're going to give a couple more raps in the same side that we had been punching from. This establishes a little bit of a flat on the other side, and it makes it easier to see. And then we're going to flip that over and try to punch out the slug by shearing it from the opposite side. So we're close to shearing that plug out, so I'm going to hang the little punched hole over the edge of the anvil and then shear it out the rest of the way by tapping it through. You can see the slug fall out and roll away. I highlighted it here in red. Punching inevitably creates some deformation, so you'll want to just kind of dress everything, flatten it out. And here you can see that newly punched hole. Since the hole we punched is much too small for our rivet, we're going to drift it open, and we're going to use the punch as a drift in this case to widen that hole. Make sure the hole is hanging over the edge so that you're not just ramming the end of the punch into the top of the anvil. And you may want to work between the far side and the near side of the anvil. That will limit the deformation. You can see that I'm doing that here. We don't want the hole to be tapered like the punch is, so we're going to flip the tong over and drift from the other side. Because the tong jaw is in the way, you can only drift from the far edge of the anvil. We want to dress everything nice and flat, but remember not to deform that hole. In this next heat, I'm just cleaning everything up and putting a chamfer on the edges of the reins so that everything looks a little nicer. I like the tips of my jaws to be a little bit beveled. This makes it easier to pick stuff up and they look a little nicer. So I'm just beveling the end right here and then dressing the jaws. Another light drift just to make sure that that hole didn't deform while I was working on the jaws. And then this is almost done. There's one end of the jaws basically done. Had a late start, so I'm gonna pick up here tomorrow. The next thing to do is make an exact copy of the tong blank that I just made on the opposite side of the bar. You want it to be an exact copy, not a mirror. Since it'd be kind of boring just to watch me do the same exact process again, I figured I'd show you the other side of the tong blank in super speed mode. So at this point, you should have two identical jaws on each side of the bar. I don't really like completely flat-jawed tongs because they don't really hold anything that well. So what I'm doing here is using a cold chisel to put a V-groove down the length of the tong jaw. This will allow you to hold square and round stock lengthwise, very securely. And there you can see that nice groove that I just formed. You will obviously want to do the same thing on the other jaw. So I'm just putting a little offset in the jaw here. When you're using small stock and you end up with a small boss, a little offset will help keep the reins from interfering with each other when you open and close the jaws. Chances are you're going to end up with a little bit of twist in your jaws. So the best thing to do is to put it in the vise and then twist the jaws straight. But my outdoor forging area doesn't have a vise, so I thought I'd show you how to do it with a pair of pliers. As long as it's a small pair of tongs, you can do it this way. And then you'll see in a moment that I'm just going to sight down the end of the tongs to look and see that everything is straight. Here you get a decent view of the roughly identical jaws that are at each end of the bar. So now we just got to mark the halfway point on the tongs and then put a mark with the silver pencil. And then I'm going to saw part of the way through so that I don't lose the halfway point. And now I'm just going to use a paint stripper disc on the angle grinder in order to clean up all of the rust and scale off of the reins and the jaws of the tongs. This part's important because you want the reins to be comfortable in your hand and you want the jaws to work smoothly, so you want all the surfaces to be nice and smooth and clean. Now what I need to do is actually cut the jaws in half and then clean up and chamfer the ends so that there's no burrs or snags. So I'm just going to use a half round file to chamfer the ends of both reins so that they're comfortable to hold on to. And you don't want a sharp corner because a lot of times you're going to be resting the end of the reins up against your leg in order to steady them. So you don't want a sharp corner digging into your skin. So here I'm just using that same paint stripper disc to clean up the jaw and the boss. I somehow lost the footage, but I ran a 1/4-inch drill bit through the holes in the pivots to make sure that they were the right size and they were round. So here I'm just making sure that everything fits together properly. So I'm just using a bolt in order to fit it up. You can actually use a bolt in place of a rivet, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But before I fit the jaws together for their final fitting, I need to clean up these grooves in the jaws. I'll give it a quick touch with the slitting disc on an angle grinder and then use the half round file to clean it up the rest of the way. And then just a little draw filing to make sure that the jaws are flat. Okay, this one's good to go. Just have to do the same thing on the other side. So the next thing I'm going to do is heat up the ends of the jaws, put the bolt through there, and then get the jaws all lined up and straight. And then we're going to rivet over the end of that bolt in order to make it permanent. In hindsight, I probably should have just straightened the jaws after everything was riveted together, because it was pretty fiddly getting that in there and tightened up without burning myself, even with the gloves. So I'm just going to snug up that bolt, and then we're going to heat everything up and then rivet over the end of the threads in order to make the connection permanent. You need to make sure that a short length of threads are poking out of the nut so that you can rivet them over. So bring everything up to a dull red, and then you hammer over the end of the threads in order to make everything permanent. Of course, the traditional way to do this would be to put an actual rivet in there and then hammer over the end of the rivet. But this is a simple way to get going on your first pair of tongs. You could always put a proper rivet in there later if you want, by cutting the end of the bolt off. Now we've got to fit the jaws to the size of stock that we want to hold. So we're going to take a piece of stock, put it in the jaws, and then lightly hammer down to fit the jaws to the stock. So here you can see that I'm just testing to see that the jaws are holding the stock well. And then the rest is just really to make sure that the stock is being held straight in the jaws. So I'm making little adjustments here and there. So to adjust the reins so that they're the proper distance apart when the stock is being held, you want to clamp the jaws together with the stock in there. Usually you would use a vise, but here I'm using a C-clamp because I don't have a vise out here. And then you adjust the reins. You either squeeze them together or you pull them apart so that they're comfortable for you to hold. You can see that I cooled one of the reins off a little bit with water because I didn't want that one to bend very much. I wanted the other one to do most of the bending. You want to adjust the reins so that they're comfortable in your hand and you can hold the stock tightly without having to use a huge amount of pressure. So these bad boys are all done. Now all we need to do is test them out. The next project in this series is making a blacksmith knife. So I grabbed a piece of W1 steel and I'm putting a point on it to get that started. Here we got a close-up of the finished product. Not the most beautiful pair of tongs I've ever made, but they function really well and we'll get a lot of good use out of them. So I hope you enjoyed the video and you learned something. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time, and happy forging.